right, we'll call the meeting of the Tennessee Advisory Council on Workers' Compensation to order. It is 1:05 p.m. on Tuesday, October 14th. We are in Legislative Plaza, Room 30 in Nashville, Tennessee. My name is Christy Allen. I'm the Assistant Treasurer for Legal Compliance and Audit in the Treasury Department. Treasurer Lillard was unable to be here today, and so he has asked me to serve as his designee. And as many of you know, I often do that, so I am happy to be here on his behalf. With that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Schroeder to call the roll, please.
Christy Allen.
Here.
Carrie Dove. Paul Schaefer.
Here.
James Hale. Bob Pitts. Here. Gary Selvey. John Burleson. Here. Paula Claytor.
Here.
Sandy Fletchall.
Present.
Bruce Fox. Dr.
Here.
Graves. Oh, Bruce Fox.
Here.
Dr. Graves. Abby Hudgens.
She's on her way.
Well, Troy Haley's here. John Harris.
Here.
Lynn Lawyer. Jerry Mayo. Dr. Merle. Greg Ramos. Mike Shinnick.
Thank you, Ms. Schroeder. So the chair detects that we do not have a physical quorum present, but it appears that we would have a quorum of the council with a voting member participating by phone. So when that happens, as you know, Tennessee Code Annotated 8-44-108 authorizes participation by electronic means if there is a necessity present. So I'm asked Ms. Schroeder to read a proposed statement of necessity that we will then ask the council to vote on before we proceed.
The purpose of this meeting is to hear and consider several presentations with respect to the council's responsibility to make a recommendation on the NCCI suggested rate filing effective March 1, 2015. By statute, the August 22, 2014 NCCI release date requires council's recommendation to the Commissioner of the Department of Commerce and Insurance by October 21, 2014. The law allows this council to meet by telephone conference call upon a determination by the council that the matters to be considered at this meeting require timely action by the body, that physical presence by all members is not possible within the period of time requiring actions, and that participation by some members by telephone is therefore necessary. If the council makes such a determination, any member participating in a meeting by telephone is deemed to be present in person at the meeting for purposes of quorum requirement and voting.
So, Ms. Schroeder, do we have a motion from any members of the council to adopt that as a statement of necessity? Moved by Mr. Dove, second by Mr. Pitts. Is there any further discussion? All in favor? And this will require a roll call vote, Ms. Schroeder.
Christy Allen.
Aye.
Carrie Dove. Paul Schaefer.
Aye.
Bob Pitts. Aye. We have a unanimous of those present.
Thank you, Ms. Schroeder. Before we continue on, I guess the next item on the agenda will be the approval of minutes. I wanted to let those present know that we have another matter that we wanted to consider under other business. But due to, we know an afternoon will be filled with presentations, I think we're going to move that item up to right now. And I think that Mr. Pitts had asked to discuss an October 9th, 2014 letter to Chairman Lillard from Commissioner McPeak. So, Mr. Pitts, I'll turn it over to you. Before you do that, we need to approve the minutes. I apologize. I apologize for that. So the second item on the agenda is the approval of minutes. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the minutes? We have a motion from Mr. Pitts. Do we have a second? Second from Mr. Dove. Is there any further discussion on the minutes of the August meeting? Hearing none. Ms. Schroeder, will you call for a vote? This also is roll call.
Carrie Dove. Paul Schaefer.
Aye.
Bob Pitts.
No.
A unanimous vote.
Thank you, Ms. Schroeder. Now we'll move on to Commissioner McPeak's letter.
Just so everyone in the audience knows, the Commissioner has communicated effectively to the Advisory Council what her intentions are regarding the assigned risk multiplier for next year. It wouldn't get any discussion before the group unless somebody chose to make a comment. We have the right, and she requests any comments that we might have. I just thought it should get to the agenda. Mike may want to say more about it. I wanted to say the following, which I hope is communicated to her. It doesn't have to be official action, but I believe the commissioner and her staff have probably prepared the most in-depth report on this subject since you've been preparing them, Mike. And to that, I compliment the work of the department and the commissioner. Because we get new people in the voting positions on the advisory council, I just wanted to call 2 or 3 things to their mind, and I can let Mike affirm that this is their position. When they start working on what a multiplier for the assigned risk pool should be each year, they do an in-depth analysis, and they start off with the idea that the overlap between the universe of the private sector market multipliers and the department should be somewhere in the range of about 20%. I believe this proposal gets it at about 23. But anyway, you need to know that's sort of the way they view it when they start up. The second thing I think the department is very sensitive about in trying to develop a multiplier, they want to avoid the accumulation of excessive surplus in the assigned risk block of business. And I think they believe they've accomplished that. The only thing I've said to Mike that I'll share with you all, and I'm not looking for a recommendation, just an observation. With those precepts and the data they've provided, I think the only nervousness, and you know, this is not pure science. So I'm not saying I disagree with the commissioner, just an observation. I think there is some concern that with the overlap and some of the multipliers in the private sector market have now gotten incredibly high, up in the range of 179 or so, I believe, Mike. And even though we're staying within 20%, it looks like our multiplier could be in the range of 144. And it looks like the department is wanting to go on the assigned risk pool. Is it 158, Mike? Some may argue that hadn't gotten any narrower, but it's getting close. And the concern is at what point, if any, is there any incentive for agents to sell to the assigned risk pool for those upper end type of cases rather than staying in the private sector market? And while I have no better answer than the commissioners provided, I just think, and she probably already knows it, it's an area of concern. But beyond that, you all did an excellent job with your documentation. I wish you would, for the record, Mike, confirm those percentages of and the surplus.
Yeah, we started having a problem with surplus back in the early 2000s, and that ranged on into about 2007. It started to diminish quite significantly 2008 and moving forward. So we've been very cautious with the pricing of the LCM in the assigned risk market ever since, and we've really, as the statute requires, tried to be careful about balancing the cost of running the plan with the multipliers in the voluntary market. So those are the two statutory considerations given the department. It's, as I was telling Bob, it's always a tightrope to make sure that we're not overcharging, because we've had a tendency to do that. You know, the variance between the voluntary market and the assigned risk plan has actually been decreasing substantially over the last 8 or 10 years, because we had the multiplier so high for the assigned risk plan. At one time, it was for 2 years, 2004 through 2009, it was a 195, I believe. So we have brought that down substantially. But there is only a variance right now. We would project to the 7 to 8% level, and that really depends largely on what happens to the voluntary market. The voluntary market has been increasing due to the cyclical nature of the insurance situation for workers' comp and other property and casualty lines, and so with that, we anticipate that will continue to go up. How much we don't know. You know, we're looking at a very substantial loss cost change projected at minus 9.6, I believe. There are probably a lot of carriers out there that are not running near that quality of a book and profitability, and they just don't have that kind of loss experience. So they will file for higher multipliers when it rolls around in March. So to address the question about incentive for the agents, I think, number one, there's always kind of a stigma in the marketplace being in the assigned risk pool. There's been a long-standing understanding, I think, in general in the marketplace that you don't get all the bells and whistles in the assigned risk market that you do in the voluntary market. So there's a bit of a rub there. I think, you know, in terms of commission, the commission in the assigned risk plan, I don't believe would be as much as it would be in the voluntary market in general. So I think those two things are big factors. Number three, an agent gets an account in the assigned risk plan, and they choose to have their data shared with everybody else, then they're much more vulnerable to lose that business in the voluntary market. So that's the third reason why I think they're motivated.
Mr. Pitts?
Madam Chair, I guess sort of in conclusion on this, thank you, Mike. With your permission and the permission of the voting members, I don't think we need an official action, but I would like for you to instruct staff to at least send a letter to the commissioner commending her on giving us an opportunity to comment, and for the outstanding documentation that was provided to us. If nobody has great terror, that out of all this, to the extent that we have a concern, which she probably does, and that is that we hope that we're doing the best thing that leads to continued holding constant or depopulation of the assigned risk pool. That's my thought.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. Is there any discussion on this item or any objection to asking Ms. Schroeder to write the letter as directed? Can we consider that by general acclamation of the council? All right. Thank you.
If I might, just again for the audience and sort of understanding what's causing these comments, if you look for the last 7 or 8 years, and I'm just sort of pulling it off the top of my head, the private sector market average multiplier has gone from like 120 or less up to now about 144. during an equal period of time, the assigned risk plan multiplier has gone from over 1.9 now down to an anticipated 1.58. So you can see convergence, a narrowing. Obviously, the assigned risk pool growth has gone up a little bit, and we get nervous anytime we don't want to put the commissioner in a position of having to redo things at that trigger point, Mike, and that's sort of the bottom of all this. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is a presentation by David Wilsterman of the Statistical Analysis and Report concerning the Tennessee Workers' Compensation data for calendar year 2013. Welcome, Mr. Wilsterman. Are you ready?
Well, if I may, while Mr. Wilsterman's getting his papers off the floor, I would like to just make a comment about the fact that this is the last year of pre-reform data that Mr. Wilsterman is dealing with. And I just wanted to take a minute to ask council members for their assistance in future statistical reporting, your thoughts, your ideas for what we want to be looking at, what you want to see post-reform. You know, the reform eliminates numerous things such as impairment ratings to arms, legs, hands. Now we're all going to have impairment ratings to the body as a whole. So David is going to have to convert some of the impairment ratings that he's getting in for the old cases into body as a whole cases in order to make statistical comparisons. Also, your council staff and the Division of Workers' Comp have been having some preliminary meetings attempting to figure out how to do that, what data is desired by the council, by the respective associations of the council. So if you have any ideas as far as what you would like to see, what kind of information you want, if there's something that hasn't been presented before that you'd like to have, if you would call me or email me that information and we can have an open conversation. We'd like to get something concrete to David by at least February. Maybe we have until March when the data comes out. So please feel free to call me, email me, whatever form's comfortable for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Schroeder. All right, Mr. Wilsterman.
Thank you. I think the computer just ran out of battery, so yeah, and there's no plug-in over there, so we'll just go without it.
Okay. Give us just a minute. We'll see.
Do you
if
want
we
me to
can get
wait,
some
or
technical?
keep
You'll wait 1 second.
All
We'll
right.
see if we can find somebody to assist us.
I'll get started. The first few things don't require graphs anyway. So, first of all, thank you for having me today. In front of you is a draft report of Tennessee workers' compensation data. The charts and tables will all stay the same. There might be some minor tweaks to some of the language used in the text of the report. Before I get going, though, I want to address a couple things about where the data supporting the report is coming from and some of its potential limitations. As I'm sure most of you are aware, the data is supplied by the Division of Workers' Compensation from SD1 forms sent in to finalize workers' compensation cases. The Advisory Council is charged with assessing the impact of various reforms dating back to the 90s. Initially, no data was available to do this, so files were pulled from the courthouses, information gathered, reports generated. It was incomplete, but it was the best data available given the time, budget, and feasibility constraints of doing a report. The SD1 allowed for reporting to expand to settlements. While this was better than just trial information, it's still a best we can do scenario. Through other case information available through the court system and discussions with the Division of Workers' Compensation, there's the potential that what is provided in the SD1 data is not necessarily complete. So in other words, there may be cases concluded that SD-WORM forms are not being sent in for. So these may be evenly distributed throughout the data and all injury types and throughout the state, thus having no effect on what you see in front of you, or there may be a group of cases that are completely not being considered. We don't know what we don't know with it. What this means for the report in front of you, you can be confident that it does what does get sent in is getting reported accurately. There's consistency from year to year in the data. The data behaves like we'd expect it to. So if there's a change in multiplier caps, we see that change. So that provides some validity to what you're seeing. And then, but also realize that there may be data that's not being reported that might influence the numbers. Moving forward, the division is committed to working with the Advisory Council to provide the most complete data possible. And it will continue the progression of workers' compensation data gathered and reported 17 years ago up till now. So we had trials, then trials and settlements, and now we're going to get a continuing more complete picture of what the cases are saying. Is there any questions with that? Thank you.
I don't see any questions. Please
All right.
continue.
This is a bookend presentation for the court-based system. As we said, this is the last of court only. It's going to be mixed for the next few years and then eventually get to the administrative system only. When the 2004 reforms were passed, the Advisory Council was to report on its effects. So I'm going to focus on mandatory mediation, the increase of the maximum compensation rate, the reduction of the multiplier to 1.5 times, and the impairment of the impairment rating, and the medical costs. Very briefly on medical costs. So. This graph shows the percentage of conclusion types as reported on SD-1 forms for the last 11 years. So what you can see is an increase in the division-approved and joint petition settlements as represented by the brown areas. So joint petitions, according to the SD-1 data, joint petitions and department-approved account for over 90% of all cases for last year. If we split that up by grand division, we can see differences in conclusion type utilization depending on the region the cases are being concluded in, with Middle Tennessee utilizing joint petitions or the court system more than East and West Tennessee does. And feel free to interrupt anytime if you have questions about any of this. Moving to maximum compensation rates, this graph shows the percent of injured workers with permanent disability at maximum compensation rate for temporary total and permanent partial benefits. So in 2004, it was changed for temporary total, the maximum benefit was increased to 110% of the state average weekly wage. And for permanent partial benefits, it was increased to 105%. These are the percent of the permanent disability cases that are at the max for each year. You can see it's evened out to just over to around 2% for temporary total max, the 110%, and around 12% or so for the permanent partial max. These graphs display, moving on to permanent partial disability multipliers. So these display for the multipliers for body as a whole, arm, and leg injury cases where the injured worker was returned to work. The multiplier is capped at 1.5 times the highest impairment rating. So prior to 2004, there was no caps on arms and leg cases. There was a 2.5 times cap on multiplier for body as a whole cases. As the cases work their way through the system, the average multipliers approach the 1.5 times. So by 2007, 2008, we're getting down to the median being at 1.5 times. You can see the mean still stays just above 1.5 times at 1.7 to 1.6, 1.5. This is because parties are free to settle at whatever amount they choose. They might be including other things in their permanent partial disability amount, or we might not have every impairment rating, especially the one that the settlement or trial was based off of. Questions on that? Okay. So if we look at 2013 by Grand Division, you can see variations between regions. Not huge, but in the median still stays at 1.5 times. And in workers' comp data, the median tends to be more predictive than the mean is. So try to place a little more trust in the light colored line. And I don't think you want a statistics lesson on why that's the case, but if you want, we can go there. So finally, here's some graphs representing medical costs at the time of conclusion for bodies as a whole, arm and leg injury cases, again, where the injured worker was returned to work. So you can see the graph is somewhat U-shaped. And I would have guessed inflation-wise and just with everything else you hear in the news that medical costs would be continually rising. And they are a little bit, but they've also, over time, 2013 is really close to where 2004 was. So if that's a result of the fee schedule, I'll let people who know more about medical issues interpret, but that appears to be what's the case. In the past, I've presented some motion graphs where the data moves around. Those are available. They're done. In your packet, there's also this broken up by Grand Division too. But it's available at this URL. You're free to go there, move the data around at your own will, and contact me if you have any questions about how to do that. But overall, any questions on the data?
Any questions for any members of the council? Okay. I don't think we have any questions about your presentation, Mr. Wilsterman. Thank you. I think Mr. Pitts has a comment or a question.
Madam Chairman, is the historian of the advisory council, probably the oldest person in the room. I just want to say to David, and I need to give everybody from an background who has not been here since the beginning. When we struggled with workers' comp policy, I guess even before there was an advisory council, there really wasn't any good data. It was all whatever you could come up with on your own. So policy got made on Capitol Hill largely by who had the best political muscle at a given time. With the development of reforms, probably the last 5, and the creation of the council, one of the desires was to get good statistical data on which to make policy judgments. And David has done yeoman work through this period, and it has been exceedingly beneficial. But you all have to understand, in going from nothing, we went to a system. We still had the court system, and the completion of the data forms that we use can vary depending on how cooperative the local judge or clerk is in submitting that data. And now, as you all know, that we've moved from a court to an administrative system, we ought to get almost a complete universe, because this data will no longer be coming from the courts, but out of the Division of Workers' Comp Administration, where the judges will sit and hear the cases. So going forward, will just be a continued improvement in data available to make policy judgments on. And David, again, thanks for all your hard work.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. Are there any further comments for Mr. Wilsterman? Seeing none, thank you. One more. No. The chair will note that the council accepts the report for the record. And thank you again, Mr. Wilsterman. We really appreciate you. Next item on the agenda is a presentation by NCCI Representative Amy Quinn and Actuary Karen Ayers on the voluntary loss costs and rating values experience filing proposed effective March 1, 2015. And if you would please state your name for the record, and then we can get started.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Quinn. I'm the State Relations Executive for NCCI, and I appreciate y'all having us here today. I always enjoy Mr. Wilsterman's reports, as I know y'all all do as well. I would point out, there's a key difference in the data set that he uses in comparison to what we do. His is a snapshot, and it's looking just at those claims that are closed. So sometimes there are some little bit of differences in things that we see. Wanted to thank Mr. Pitts, who just left the room, but for a couple years ago, him making the suggestion that we set something up a little bit different so that we communicate more thoroughly up front, and then also, of course, to Mr. Shinnick and to Ms. Schroeder as well for everything y'all have done to help with that. It's definitely been quite a bit different this last couple of years with much more thorough communication, and we appreciate that. So with that, I'd like to introduce Karen Ayers, our actuary, for her to give her report. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ayers, if you would go ahead and state your name for the record.
Yes, thank you. My name's Karen Ayers, and I'm a Director and Actuary with the National Council on Compensation Insurance. And I would like to start really just seconding what Amy said, thanking the council, thanking Mr. Shinnick and the department for helping us to really improve this process and be able to get a more effective communication strategy in place. Things, from my perspective as one of the actuaries, have worked very well the last couple of years. With the process in place last year, we were able to make a very smooth transition with the new consulting actuaries who are working on behalf of the department this year. And, again, from my perspective as the actuary for NCCI in this process, I think the communication's been great. It's been very effective and, very helpful to me, and hopefully very helpful to the consulting actuaries as well. And hopefully the results of all of that improved communication and coordination and really just cooperation between us, it makes a smoother process for the advisory council as well. So I'm going to start with just focusing on finding my presentation. My apologies there. So I'm going to start, my presentation is going to focus on NCCI's filing, which is now before the Department of Commerce and Insurance. And I'm going to focus on our analysis, the methodology that underlies our analysis, and our recommendations for the proposed loss cost change. I'm going to start with this summary of the proposed indication. You can see here it's for a decrease of 9.6%. This overall indication is derived from data that's reported to NCCI from carriers. It's what we refer to as our aggregate financial data. It's aggregated by the companies. There's not a lot of underlying detail in terms of individual classifications. This is their aggregate data for the state of Tennessee. The components of this change are shown here. It makes up 9.2% of this 9.6% proposed decrease derived from experience, which is basically additional year of data that we have since we submitted the filing that became effective on March 1st, 2014. Improvement in the experience that we have reviewed here. Changes in loss development patterns, that is, changes of how losses emerge over time, is responsible for a decrease of just 0.2%. This is a very small impact of the change in development. A proposed change in our trend that we will be looking at, we're going to talk about this more later in my presentation, but we are proposing a change in our trend factors that is responsible for a decrease of just over 0.5%. A benefit change, we just have a small increase here. This is a change in the maximum weekly benefit that's derived from the change in the state average weekly wage, and a small change for the update to the Medicare basis of the medical fee schedule. We have a small proposed increase in our provision for loss adjustment expense, 0.3%, and these pieces all roll up to a 9.6% decrease. While this is based on our overall aggregate financial call data, we also have to then take it to a second step, which is to distribute this change and figure out an appropriate level of loss costs for the 600 and some different occupational classifications that we have. So we use a separate database that gets more detailed data to take that overall change and distribute it to the various occupations and industry groups. And this just shows you the range of indications across the different industry groups. And these reflect the actual loss experience for the classes in each of those groups. And these changes range from a 14.2% decrease in the manufacturing industry group to a 6.1% decrease for the miscellaneous industry group. And I will just say that this range of indications by industry group is fairly typical of what we see in other states and what we have seen historically in Tennessee. There was nothing here that struck us as any particular cause for concern. This is a very typical look. In brief, the methodology underlying this indication, our experience period, we have looked at the latest 2 policy years, and I will say that in deriving this indication and looking at this methodology, we look at a number of different types of methodology. We look at different years of experience, and the result of all of our analysis has resulted in this summary right here. So we're looking at the latest 2 policy years. We're looking at a loss development methodology that looks at paid plus case losses, which means it includes history of what has happened as losses are paid out, but also individual claim adjusters' estimates of what the case reserves are needed on individual claims. And this is consistent with the methodology that we've used here for a number of years, largely because of the reform history that's been in place in Tennessee, particularly some changes with settlement, medical settlement requirements that happened in the 2004-2005 reforms, and then the undoing of those in 2010 has distorted some of our underlying, we feel it's distorted the history of the paid loss development, which makes that not as accurate predictor of what the indicated rate level need should be. So we've been focusing on paid plus case, although we have been looking at the paid loss development as well. And then in looking at the paid plus case development factors, we're looking at a 5-year history of how the losses have changed over time. Again, that's consistent with the methodology that we've used in Tennessee in the past. I am going to go back. I know that this use of the latest 2 policy years for the experience period has been an item of discussion. It was last year. It's also an area where the consulting actuaries have a different opinion or different view of the length of the experience period. And it was an item that was mentioned in the commissioner's rate decision from last year that NCCI give additional consideration to using a different experience period. So I am going to talk about that in a little bit more detail after I share a few more summary slides about the results that we're looking at. So when we're looking at the loss history for rate filing purposes, we need to look at our historical data, but the historical data was all actually transpired with different rates in effect, different benefit levels in effect. So in order to use that body of historical data to evaluate the adequacy of the current loss costs, we adjust everything as though it were written at today's loss costs, and that the benefit history was all taking place at today's current benefit levels. And that's what you see on this graph here. We show the results separately for the indemnity benefits, which are essentially your lost wages, and the medical benefits. The medical indemnity split in Tennessee, it's approximately 30% of the benefit dollar goes towards paying indemnity benefits, and about close to 70% is for medical. You can see here the indemnity loss ratios are much lower than the medical loss ratios. Again, these results kind of vary from state to state. It depends on the statutory construct in a state and depends on benefit levels and other factors that are state specific, but this is not atypical for us to see medical loss ratios that are much higher than the indemnity loss ratios. And the indemnity medical split in Tennessee of 30-70, a little more heavily weighted to medical than on a countrywide basis. For NCCI states, it's more like 40% indemnity and 60% medical. So my goal in showing you this chart is to just show a history. It goes back to 2005 of the data that we're looking at and the experience that we are reviewing on the basis that we're reviewing it for determining what we believe the loss costs need to be. We will later. I will show you different components of how these loss ratios break out in terms of the number of claims that happen and the average cost of those claims. But overall, you can see here on the indemnity side, there's been a steady decline in the indemnity loss ratios over time. Medical, since 2005 and some of the reforms that were enacted in those years, a little bit more volatility than we had experienced in the past, and I would say that volatility continues. So the first component that I'm going to talk about in detail is the experience period. NCCI's filed indications, as I mentioned, reflect the latest 2 policy years of experience. To just briefly talk about why we look at policy year gives us a good view of the data that's being reported and what carriers are experiencing on a matched premiums and losses. So policy year means that we're looking at all of the premium and loss experience for policies that were written in a particular year. So policy year 2011 and 2012 are the 2 latest years that we're looking at. So we have all of the experience that goes with every policy that was written in 2011 and every policy that was written in 2012. The latest 2 years of experience looking at that gives us the ability to really reflect the premium volume in Tennessee. Tennessee is a fairly large volume state, and it's also responsive to recent trends and experience impacts that we are seeing. In actuarial science, there's always a need to try and balance stability and responsiveness. It's always a matter of deciding where on that equilibrium your balance point will be, and NCCI believes that for the volume in Tennessee and for some other factors that we haven't specifically identified a single factor that's contributing to the improved loss experience in Tennessee. We do believe that a 2 policy year experience gives us appropriate reflection of the recent trends that are occurring in the data. This indicated loss cost decrease is being driven by a number of different factors. As I said, we did not identify a single driver of the change. When we have unusual situations in a state that cause a result that is different than what we've experienced historically, there are times when we are able to identify a particular single driver. An example would be if there's a large catastrophic loss that occurs that causes the experience in a particular year to be much worse than we typically see. If we were to experience something like that, we are able to adjust for that in very particular ways so that it doesn't have a single year spike in the proposed loss cost that we are filing. In investigating the driver of the decrease for Tennessee, we focused on policy year 2011 because that's the year that was common between last year's filing and this year's filing. So we looked at improvement that we saw for policy year 2011 and said, okay, what are the components that are driving the improvement in the policy year 2011 experience? And what we found was that there were a number of different factors that were each having a small impact on the overall results. So not a single driver that we could point to and say, this is the reason that these results are so much better. We saw that that the emerged loss experience was better than we would have expected based on the loss development factors that we selected in last year's filing. We saw that claim frequency and severity were continuing to improve, so that produced an improvement in just the loss experience in general. We had a couple changes in our tail factors and a couple of factors actually that caused the indication to be slightly higher, a few tenths of a point than it would have otherwise been. And we implemented a new methodology for determining the excess loss factors. This is a factor that NCCI applies. Our loss indication methodology caps losses so that there's no single loss that's having a greater impact than 1% on the overall indication. But when we cap these actual losses that may have been excessive, we load in an amount for the expected excess loss. We changed our methodology for determining that loading factor, and that had the impact of reducing the indication a little bit further. That new methodology has already been filed and approved to become effective in conjunction with this loss cost filing. But this is the first filing in which this new excess ratio methodology was reflected. So that also had an impact on this improved loss experience. So again, because there wasn't a single driving factor, nothing in the data to suggest to us that there was an anomaly, there were no unresolved edits or questions from the data providers about errors in their data. Everything in terms of the way it was reported to NCCI appeared reasonable. And so for those reasons, we believe that a 2-year experience period provides a reasonable and appropriate result. As I said, a lot of this was driven in consideration of the Commissioner's decision last year that NCCI consider the use of a longer experience period when there's a high degree of variability in the results for the years that are underlying the filing. And when we looked at the results for the latest 3 policy years, and actually the latest 2 policy years, it was our judgment that the results for the latest 2 policy years were much closer together, very similar magnitude, than was the situation last year, looking at policy year 2010 and 2011. So that was one consideration in our maintaining the 2 policy years. Again, Tennessee has significant volume from which to base our loss cost indications. When I looked at across all of the NCCI states, Tennessee is about the 7th or 8th largest state that we review. And I looked at these states by volume, and I looked at the methodology that's used, because we do have some states where we use longer experience periods. We have states where we use 3 years. We have some very, very small states where we actually use 5 policy years, because there is just a significant amount of volatility in their results from year to year. If I look at these and I rank the states, the largest state that uses more than 2 policy years is less than half the size of Tennessee. So again, I felt that gave me a reasonableness check on the volume and whether it could be deemed to be credible for the determination of the loss costs. I guess the final consideration for NCCI in maintaining the 2 policy years is that when possible, and unless there's a reason for us to change, we prefer to maintain a consistent methodology from year to year. Now, obviously, if something were to happen, and again, when the reforms were enacted back in the early 2000s, we said, well, because of the nature of the reform, there will be reasons why we no longer can use paid loss development. So for situations like that that are specifically identifiable, we do change our methodology. There was nothing specific that caused me to say, okay, the methodology that we've been using is inappropriate. And in order to avoid introducing bias into the rate-making process or introducing a perception of bias, by making a different selection depending on whether losses are improving or losses are getting worse, it's NCCI's preference to maintain a consistent methodology where there's no obviously compelling reason to not do so. So again, for that reason, because there was nothing specific that we identified as an indication that our methodology was not appropriate, we have maintained the 2 policy year methodology. The next major piece of our filing where there is a change, not in our methodology per se, but in our selections, is on the trend factors. And we have to apply a trend in our development of the indications because we're using historical data that transpired over the last several years, but we are trying to project loss costs that will be adequate for policies that are effective beginning March 1st, 2015. So we have to account for changes that are expected to occur between now and then. These would mostly be inflationary type factors. So the loss ratios that, going back to slide 5 that we looked at, are what NCCI looks at as the basis for our trend, but we can take these loss ratios and we can divide them into the two components to look at the frequency of claims, so in other words, the number of claims that occur, and then claim severity, which is the average cost of those claims. When we look at a history of what's happened on claim frequency over the last several years, we see here on the long term overall, not a lot of change. Going back to 2005, 2006, the frequency levels in 2012 were very similar to what we saw in the early period. We did see an increase in 2009 and 2010, and then a subsequent decline in the last 2 years. A lot of this is driven by the impacts of the recession, and I believe I mentioned this last year in my presentation. This is very consistent with what we saw in other states as a result of the impact of the recession and the subsequent recovery. Looking at that, what has happened to the average cost of a claim, indemnity claim severity, this is an average cost of a lost time claim, has declined steadily since 2006, and that decline has continued into the latest year. This is reflected in our selection of the indemnity trends, and this is a reflection of how we expect lost time benefits to change relative to workers' wages. And we believe that these indemnity trends will continue to be favorable. Our proposed trend for this filing, we are proposing reducing the trend from a rate of -3% per year to a rate of -3.5% per year. On the medical side, as I mentioned previously, there's been a little bit more volatility when we look at the average cost of a medical claim. This is the average medical benefits paid on a lost time claim. So we've seen a little bit more volatility here. It increased in 2009. We had 2 years of declines last year, and we're actually seeing an increase in the latest year. The latest year claim severity does bring the costs back in line with what the average severity was back in 2005. Our filed our filed medical trend is 0. That means we expect cost of medical benefits to continue to change at about the same rate as workers' wages. We're not proposing any change to this 0% trend. Despite the increase in the latest year, we believe that a trend of 0 is still reasonable. So again, this is just a summary of what's in our proposed loss cost filing. And again, the impact of the reduction, the proposed reduction in the indemnity trend has an impact of reducing the indication by 0.6%. The final piece that I have to talk about that's been an item of discussion for the last several years, even preceding my tenure here in Tennessee, is the loss adjustment expense provision. There's been a lot of discussion, I'm sure there will be again today, about the loss adjustment expense. I believe that last year, because there was also the discussion about the experience period, my recollection this morning fondly of Mr. Pitts and the Halloween treat that he gave me last year was concession that the filed LAE provision last year was acceptable because we made different changes from what was indicated based on the experience period discussion. But I know we'll have more discussion right now about the loss adjustment expense. So NCCI's standard methodology for the loss adjustment expense, our starting point is countrywide data that is reported by carriers on a NCCI financial call, countrywide data with results reported separately for losses and the two components of loss adjustment expense. We have the defense and cost containment expense and then adjusting and other expense. The DCCE piece, as I'll refer to, defense and cost containment, reflects the countrywide result. Again, this is our starting point. It reflects a countrywide result, and then we adjust that by state-specific relativity of how paid DCCE relates to paid loss. And then our filed adjusting another expense provision reflects the countrywide result. These expenses are typically ones that are more operational in nature as opposed to being state-specific related to how claims are administered in a given state. So the countrywide provision, it's not really possible or practical or necessary to try to allocate those kinds of expenses by state because they do reflect more countrywide operations of carriers. When we look at the data from this countrywide call, the data is reported by accident year. So it's expenses that are paid and losses that occur on claims that occurred during a given year. Because of this, each year when we look at this, we have additional information about payments that were made for these accidents. These estimates can change from year to year. And the focus of the discussion for the last several years has been that when we look at this for the DCCE in particular, it shows that our estimates for any given year tend to decline over time. Our estimates of adjusting and other haven't shown a similar pattern, and so there's been less discussion about that particular provision. And then I also note that our DCCE ratios, when we look just at, for example, 2011 to 2012 to 2013, that pattern does show an upward trend with higher ratios in the more recent years. To summarize what's in our filing, we currently have an approved DCCE provision of 12.5%, an approved adjusting another expense provision of 7.3 for a total loss adjustment expense provision of 19.8. In our proposed loss cost filing, we've proposed a slight increase in the DCCE provision to 12.8%, adjusting and other. The latest indication remains at 7.3 for a total LAE of 20.1%. Now, because this has been an issue of discussion in the last several years, I just wanted to talk about the fact that NCCI actually has gone back after each of these filings, at least after each of the last proceedings in which I've been involved. We have gone back and tried to do some additional analysis. We have made some changes in some of the underlying selections that we have made. The first couple things here, identify those in conjunction with the 2012 LAE review, and actually this one did precede me here in Tennessee. We did modify our selections underlying the analysis to acknowledge that we recognized that this trend was happening. We picked 2-year loss development factors instead of 3-year factors in order to try to be more responsive to what was emerging in the data. Last year, one of the things that we looked at, one of the consulting actuaries had suggested an alternative methodology where instead of looking at the pieces, the loss adjustment expense piece and the losses separately, developing them separately, that we actually just look at the ratios, develop the ratios. It's another methodology that could give us a check on reasonableness of the provisions that were coming out of our other methodology. So we did go back and look at that, and we found the results were very consistent with what came out of the standard methodology. We saw last year perhaps some continuation of this downward development pattern, but it was masked a little bit. I talked about this a little bit in my presentation. It was masked by the inclusion of a large carrier whose data was not able to be included in prior reviews. So it was a little hard to weed out those distortions to see whether this pattern of downward development was going to continue. But we did continue to investigate these patterns of the downward development. Nothing evident that came out in terms of data anomalies or anything specific that was driving the continued downward pattern to the extent that it still remains, but it is something that we continue to investigate. And in fact, in this year's countrywide analysis, we did observe yet another downward decline in the ratios that similar to what we had seen in the past. In order to acknowledge that pattern, we made again another methodology adjustment and a selection adjustment where instead of looking at the latest 2 accident years of loss adjustment expense provisions, we have extended that, and we're now using a 3-year average to try and mitigate the potential that this downward development will influence future loss adjustment expense provisions. One final thing that I did that was related to this issue, but not direct outcropping of the countrywide loss adjustment expense review, is that I was able to look at Tennessee-specific DCCE data that's reported in our normal financial data calls that we use to develop the overall indication. So carriers do report Tennessee-specific DCCE data, and we now have a sufficient history that we are able to get reasonable projections based on just Tennessee. It's not a countrywide number. We are able to look at just Tennessee ratios of DCCE to loss and make different separate projections of what this would indicate for a DCCE provision. So I looked at that information, and it was part of the information that I shared with the consulting actuaries in order for them to do their analyses. The results of a variety of methods that I was able to do on this suggested that a 12.8% DCCE provision was appropriate based solely, again, on this Tennessee data. So those are, in summary, those are the factors that drove our recommendation for the 12.8% DCCE provision. All those pieces rolled up together, including the impacts of the revised trend factors, the inclusion of a new year of experience, produces the 9.6% decline that we have filed. I will now be happy to entertain any questions that any of the members of the council have.
Thank you, Ms. Ayers, for your presentation. Any council members have any comment or question at this time? Mr. Pitts?
Madam Chair, I assume we're going to save the detailed discussions after we've heard all of the presenters. But on page 6, either now or in a callback, your last comment, NCCI has implemented a new methodology for determining the excess loss factors. This has resulted in lower excess ratios. Tell me in one sentence, what does that mean in terms of your filing?
It means that had we not changed the methodology, the indication would have been less negative than it is. So in other words, instead of filing a minus 9.6, we would have filed, I'd have to, subject to confirmation of the actual numbers, the indication would have been minus 8.5 instead of minus 9.6. You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Ayers. Any further comments or questions from members of the council? The council will receive your report. For the record, thank you very much.
Thank you.
appreciate it. The next item on the agenda is a presentation by Advisory Council on Workers' Compensation Actuary by the Numbers Actuarial Consulting Incorporated, Lisa Dennison, on the voluntary loss costs and rating values experience filing proposed effective March 1, 2015. So, Ms. Dennison, you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm probably going to need help with this too.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
And Ms. Dennison, if you'll just state your name for the record, we'll start whenever you're ready.
I'm Lisa Dennison, and I am a consulting actuary and president of By the Numbers Actuarial Consulting. We go by the name BINAC, too. You may see that. And we have been commissioned by this committee to prepare a review of the NCCI filing that was just presented. Okay. Okay, I'm going to start with our findings, and you'll note we've gone through the filing and the technical supplement and did a lot of emails back and forth with the NCCI with our questions, and we've kind of just summarized where we have I wouldn't say discrepancies, where we have differing opinions as to what our selections are versus the NCCI. So I want to kind of just highlight those and not present what the NCCI already has done. The first point is that we do think the change that they proposed of minus 9.6% is reasonably calculated in accordance with actuarial standards of practice. Now, I will say that we're going to come and we'll present a number that's lower, that we think, not lower, it's actually higher, less negative, that we think is more reasonable, but we still think their estimate is reasonable. There has been some discussion about the longer experience period, and we really believe a 3-year period should be used, a 3 or longer experience period should be used. And if, based on what our calculations are, we're coming up with a selection of minus 5.7%. And I just want to review the commissioner's recommendation last year. Her order, Commissioner Julie Mix-McPeak, recommended that the NCCI increase the experience period for future filings from 2 to 3 or more years when there's a high degree of variation in the experience data. And what I want to show you is that we believe that there is a high degree of variation in that period, and we think that is warranted, and we agree with her order. The next point is that we agree that the selected trend factors of 0.965 for indemnity and 1.0 for medical are reasonable. And the NCCI uses a 15-year experience period on that. And the one thing I want to highlight, too, is they use judgment all through their modeling. And there are different points of view that we're going to have where we think maybe they should use more years or less years, and want to highlight those. But their objective is different than ours. And we're coming in and we're saying, okay, this is what they've selected. We think that's reasonable. And where we don't agree, we're going to offer an alternative. And what we want to offer more stability. I think stability is very important, that we don't have a big decrease and then a year from now have an increase. So if we can just kind of head towards a smoother transition to reflect the loss experience, I think that is better for the state of Tennessee. Our LA allowance of 19.8% we believe is a little more appropriate than the 20.1% proposed by the NCCI. And again, our indication is minus 5.7% compared to minus 9.6%. This graph is not going to come up. Unfortunately, y'all have handouts. But this is just a summary of what they filed. This is nothing that we did. It's just kind of a summary. You'll see there is some variation. This is the 2011 and 2012 years. The loss ratios for indemnity are 28.1% and 27.1%. The medical is 60.1 and 64.9. So you've got variation of about 4.8 points in medical and about 1 point or 0.01 in indemnity. But when you combine them, they're a little bit closer. You've got 0.882 for 2011 and you got 0.920 for 2012. But I want to highlight the variation in the medical because we do have about 4 points difference. So the selected was 0.901, which converts to a decrease of 9.9%, 1 minus 0.901. The change in loss-based expenses, again, Karen just presented this. It seems a little repetitive. The DCCE ratio is 12.8%. The AOE is 7.3%. So the proposed is 20.1%. Last year it was 19.8%. So that's an increase of 0.3%. So when you combine the decrease of 9.9 with the increase to the loss-based expenses of 0.3%, that gives you the overall change of minus 9.6 that's being proposed by the NCCI. Just wanted to highlight some of the factors and what's going on with these factors that are the basis of the filings. There's a lot of calculations that go in the filing, and it seems like we just pull out some numbers in there. You will see that the premium development factor is much higher this year, not much higher, but it's 1.006. Last year was 0.997 and 0.994. One of the things I wanted to highlight here is the NCCI uses, I think, a 3-year window when they pick the the development factor for that. So here they're picking 3 years, and each point of selection they pick a certain number of years that they think is reasonable. But there was a factor in there of 0.987, but all the other factors were greater than 1. So that kind of biased those 2 prior years. And really, all the factors but 1 in that 5-year window were were greater than 1. So finally, when that 3rd year rolls off, now the factor is greater than 1. So I'm just trying to highlight where, sometimes there needs to be some judgment more than just that, okay, we picked 3 years, okay, we picked 5 years. What's underlying the data? The indemnity factors for development have increased slightly. What's interesting is the medical have decreased slightly. So in combination, there's not a big change. And then the indemnity this year went from 0.97 to 0.965. And again, they're looking at a 15-year window. And after looking at 15 years, finally we're seeing that it really is a pretty decent less than 1 factor. So that we agree with that, but we just want to highlight it. The medical trend factor decreased a couple of years ago from 1.005 to 1.0. And the LAE loading, the last 2 years was 19.8. Now it's 1.201. And again, we're suggesting 1.198. And then the excess loss loading factor that Mr. Pitts highlighted has changed dramatically. The one thing I want to say, because I want to address that you brought it up, and I think it is an area of concern, we have the deadline to get the report to the commission by October 2nd, I believe it was, and we were still asking questions about that, and we hadn't got any information by the time we were in the process of writing the report to address that issue. So I think that's something that we didn't have time to look into deeper, and we weren't getting the information in time to do that. So I just want to highlight that. I don't want you to think it was an area that we did not notice. We did notice it. We just couldn't get the backup information to comment on it. You'll see the premium development factors did not change for the older policy year, which would be the first year prior, and the development factors pretty much did the same thing. They're coming down for medical, and they've gone up a little bit for indemnity. Okay, the next slide, I just like to show lots of numbers because it just highlights what we do. People in the audience can't see it, but you have it in front of you. We go through and say, okay, in the 5-year window, what would the estimates be for the last 5 years? The NCCI shows the last 2 years and picks based on that. We want to go back 5 years. If we had those same claims back starting in 2008 in the upcoming year, how much would they cost? If we had the premium, how much would the premium be, bringing it on level? And then looking at each of those 5 years and what would be the indication for each year in that 5-year window if we selected it. And I'm going to go to the next page because I don't like to show a lot of numbers. I just want to show the illustration of what we go through. These are the projected cost ratios. So for 2008, we had that 2008 year again, those same claims. We would need to decrease our premium 3.8%, so 1 minus 0.962. If we had 2009 again, we'd actually have to increase 4.4%. So that year is an indication up. 2010 is an indication up too of 1.8%. The last 2 years are the 2 lowest in the 5-year window, and those are the only 2 years that are selected when the NCCI is selecting their overall rate indication. So they averaged the last 2 years and got 0.901. We averaged the last 3 years and got 0.943. And again, we believe, going back to the commissioner's statement in order, that there is variation in those numbers. There's not a straight downward trend. There's not a level trend. It appears somewhat random, but perhaps you could say the last couple of years are better, so we're on a better trend. But we're trying to provide more stability to the rates, and I think that's the core of the issue between what we're selecting and what the NCCI is. We're concerned with stability in the marketplace. So based on that, we selected the minus 5.7%. If you go to the next page, just wanted to highlight the other area that we we had a different selection than the NCCI. Again, if you look at the ratios combined, we combined the DCCE and the AOE from 2003 on. You will see, 17.5% going on down to 20.9. The concern is in 2012 and 2013 that was raised last year, and I believe the year before, and maybe even the year before that, is that the most current years come down, that there's actually downward development that's not reflected in these numbers. So what we did is we selected the last 3 years to reflect that perhaps the last 2 years are biased high, which gave us the 19.8%, which is also the current provision. So we don't believe that there should be a change in the LAE. So we're proposing the same as the current provision. And then just in summary, if you go really down to the bottom, we show the loss ratios. One other thing I do want to address, let me go through this and I'll address a couple other things I want to talk about. The NCCI has selected the 0.901. We selected the 0.943. We proposed the LAE allowance of the current of 19.8. So our overall indication is minus 5.7. Again, lower, actually higher than the minus 9.6. One of the things we did review, and I think it's important to look at, and we didn't talk about it because we didn't select it, but we did go through it in the report, and this is just a presentation. It's not the report. We did look at paid losses because those reforms at this point are over 10 years ago, so we thought it was important to look at it. For many years, the NCCI said we've looked at it and didn't agree that we should use it. They've used the paid plus case. They provide similar results, so we're getting to the point where we may be able to use the paid method, but we did not select it in the methodology. We still think there's maybe a year or two that we need to wait and see. And I really just want to go back to the judgment. I know the NCCI has made some choices along the way of what they believe is reasonable and how many years they select. And, again, it's just the balance between responsiveness and stability. And when they're selecting trend factors, the trend factors are very variable. And I wish I had a graph of it. It's in the report, and I should have pulled it out for the presentation. But the reason they look at 15 years is to narrow reduce the variability. So they go to 15 years for that. When they select development factors, they use a longer experience period. They use, I believe, 5 years, again, to reduce the variation. So we agree with the Commissioner's order of last year that more years should be used. We believe 3 is reasonable. I'm fine with 5, too. I think 5 years provides a really good balance between, reflects a lot of stability, and I think that's really important to the Commission. So that's our presentation. Are there any questions?
Do the council members have any questions for Ms. Dennison? Thank you so much for your presentation. The council will receive that for the record. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
The next item on the agenda is a presentation by the Department of Commerce and Insurance Actuary, Bickerstaff, Watley, Ryan, and Burkhalter Consulting Actuaries. I believe Chris Burkhalter is presenting today. This will be on the voluntary loss cost and rating values experience filing proposed effective March 1st, 2015. If you'd state your name for the record, we'll start whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I'm Chris Burkhalter, Vice President, Principal of Bickerstaff, Watley, Ryan, and Burkhalter. I'm out of Madison, Mississippi, and of course I'm the rookie here. I've heard a lot about you guys, a lot about this meeting. Couple things. I was almost expecting the other actuaries to be in riot gear when I got here. That didn't happen. Everything's been really smooth, I have to say, between all the actuaries. But I understand there's some type of history here. And the other thing I heard today, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it was Brian said that this group actually enjoys this meeting and gets into it. that they actually enjoy sitting and listening to three actuaries in a row present numbers. And I said, I got to see these guys, so I hope you enjoy it. I've enjoyed working with the actuaries, and everybody's been wonderful and supportive of it. When you walk into a new project like this, it's just a blank slate. And so I think the best way to approach it is basically with no preconceived notions. Now, we did have some preliminary discussions about recent history, but then I tried to put blinders on pretty much as I looked at parameters. And we built our rate indications pretty much to parallel NCCI's, and that's really mainly for the reason that if you approach it from a totally different approach, you can have different parameters you're using that if things don't line up, you may never find the differences. So it's good. For example, we could trend frequency and severity separately, where NCCI trends them together. And then, if one of us does one and one of us does the other, it may be harder to find where our differences lie. So this process is pretty streamlined. We use the NCCI approach, and really in reviewing this, we came up with blinders on with pretty much the same issues, slight discrepancies that we had. The loss development factors, the loss ratio trends, LAE provision selection, and the experience period. And really only one of these had a major bearing, and I know you've all read ahead and know, but we'll step into them one by one. First of all, the loss development factors. What I noticed when I looked at it was that there seemed to be what we'd call a calendar year spike in the last diagonal of the triangle. So you see what you're looking at here are policy years. Actually, these are intervals 1 to 2 years of age, 2 to 3, and this is the percentage that your paid plus case losses would grow, for example, between 1 and 2 years and 2 and 3 years. Now, this obviously you'd expect the most development to occur in the 1 to 2 year interval when claims are still being reported and more is being learned about them, and then that development falls off. But what you'll notice is that in the latest year, which is in the rightmost bar of each of these sections, that in the 2 to 3 there seemed to be a bit of a spike, and then in the out years of 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, there tended to be spikes. Now the ones far out don't look that substantial, but relative to the ones before them, they did stand out. So we felt that it was appropriate to use a shorter term average of loss development and reflect a higher loss development in the indemnity. You'll also notice that there tends to be in 2 to 3, in the 3 to 4, and the 4 to 5, you'll see an upward trend in those bars too. So we felt like reflecting that would be appropriate. We did that, and that increased the indemnity a little bit, but in an effort certainly not to be biased about it, we applied basically the same statistic to medical, and actually medical went in the other direction. So it was pretty much close to a wash, but this is the kind of thing when you approach it, with blinders on, that you may pick out these things, and sometimes they have an impact. In this case, they really didn't. Okay, next, trends. I'm splitting this trend into claim frequency and claim severity, as NCCI has done in the filing to show you, and the scale is a little different. The blue bar here is the one that hops around a little bit as the actual claim frequency from the NCCI filing. You'll see that the all-year trend is minus 1.6% per year when you fit that to a curve, and the correlation of that curve is pretty high at about 88.5%, and correlation's not causation, and we don't just base any selections on that, but you'll note that the frequency has leveled out over the last 5 to 6 years. There was a little spike in 2010 that's come back down, and that 5-year trend is a more modest minus 0.4 and definitely less correlated. It hugs that green line a lot less than the blue hugs the red there. So this kind of tells us that if the correlation's broken down versus all year and recent year, you might want to look at a longer trend for stability. In severity, it's actually the opposite case for indemnity here. The all-year trend is a minus 1.8, and it's correlated about 78%. And then a 5-year trend is a lot more pronounced at a minus 4.8, and the correlation's almost perfect. But this is one where negative trends like this in severity, they can certainly occur through various means in the workers' comp system. But ultimately, in indemnity and more so in medical, a negative trend is always to be suspicious to us, because we all know basically that inflation works in the opposite direction. So all that really to say that at the end of the day, we decided really that the trend that NCCI used was appropriate. We selected the same trends that they did, minus 3.5 and a 0 for medical. Okay, on to LAE, and what you see here, these are policy years along the bottom, and these are actually the developed LAE to loss ratios that NCCI has produced. So here's a graphical representation of what you guys have been struggling with for a few years. You see the fall off each year, and it's nice and pronounced. And as Karen explained, they went through a change in methodology, which is what good actuaries do when they realize that something's not being reflected. So hopefully that flattens out, and I do believe it will. But as we both stated, this year it was another significant drop really in these that you can see circled. So what we did was develop those out more to what we think where they would flatten out. But we also observed an upward trend left to right in these years. So we chose the most recent year, which was a 19.4 versus a 20.1 of NCCI. I believe it was a little below by the numbers at 19.8, but it was, it only really affected the indication, as we'll see in a minute, by about half a point or so. Okay, and then on to the real focus here that everybody's been talking about, the experience period. Here's NCCI's indicated cost ratios for the 11 and the 2012 year, and their selection of 0.901. That's basically a minus 10% before the LAE provision comes in. And then you see where our estimates lie. You'll see, first of all, the 2011 and the 2012 are really not that far off at all. All of the things I just talked about really kind of washed out and agreed with NCCI's numbers. But the prior 3 years, that's where the kicker is, obviously. Now, I guess my philosophy is I always tell my clients that the farther right you go on any graph, the more I'm in it, the more it's actuarially estimated. So yes, those two numbers to the right look good, and you do want to reflect, improving experience, just like you would want to raise loss cost in an environment in increasing costs. But even in a static workers' comp environment, the farther right you go, the more actuarial estimation is, the more there's a chance of model error, as actuaries call it, that we've got the development off a little, or that the adverse development might occur later. So stability is always something you seek, and in a static environment, it's already kind of fraught with danger to stay on the right end of the graph. But with the changes that you guys have had in the comp environment over the last couple years, what is modeled is a lot more, because you're really modeling a lot of changes in the benefit levels and the the reforms that you've had in the last 2 years. So there's a lot more to the modeling, and you never know until about 3 or 4 years later how close you are on each of those pieces. So I think it's even more incumbent on you to reflect a longer-term average until you've had a few years of somewhat of a static workers' comp environment in terms of law, regulation, medical fee schedule, and such. So what we did here was we didn't do a 5-year average. We didn't do a 3-year average. We gave 30% weight to 2012, 25, 20, 15, and 10. And I added that up just a minute ago, and I swear it's 100. So I've double-checked that part. So where did I get that number? That from a actuarial paper on homeowners insurance by a guy from Allstate in the 80s. In other words, it's actuarial judgment, and it has to be. Everything you hear about what is most appropriate falls in the realm of actuarial judgment. So there's really no way around that. But I did feel it was appropriate because it gives the higher weight to the emergent experience. It holds on to the older weight and then lets it slide off the back instead of falling off the back. So here were the major assumptions. Shorter term LDFs, which raised indemnity and lowered the medical. Actually did this with the tail loss development factors as well, and those worked in the other direction. So it was all kind of, it really is not very exciting because it all kind of came back to the same point. Trends of -3.5 and 0, those were NCCIs, and 19.4% LAE ratio instead of NCCI's 21. And then the 5-year weighted average for the indication. So this is how we get from NCCI to us. The LDFs would take you from a -9.6 to a -9.4. Tail factors another 3 points. As we move to the right of the graph into the blue, the trend is the same, so that stays where you are. Then you see when we do the LAE provision, it actually knocks us, so we'd actually be 1 point below NCCI if we hadn't re-evaluated the experience periods. And then the experience periods is what takes it to the -4.4. And that's really where we are. I will state, as Lisa did, and it is in my report, because this is actuarial judgment, I do believe that NCCI's methodology it conforms to actuarial standards of practice, is reasonably computed. I could support it actuarially. It's just not the optimal indication. If you ever find two actuaries that exactly agree on anything, you need to take a picture, because it just doesn't happen. It's more random than the numbers. You know, you're not going to find it a lot. I think you guys know that, though, don't you? From what I hear. So that's pretty much the end of the presentation. My acknowledgments in this first round. Everybody really in total has been nice. I love working in the volunteer state. We'll say that, you know, there were some people that tried to haze us as the freshmen. I'm not going to name names, but Lisa and her firm tried to get us to believe that there was a evening formal dress code, and fortunately my assistant's less gullible than me, so he got the tuxedo rentals canceled before we lost the deposit money. But on the flip side, Karen Ayers, she tried to make me feel a little more comfortable, and she'll probably even say she didn't really do this, but I know you did. See, this is last year's technical supplement on the left before we're involved, and then on the right, this is this year's. And you'll notice the nice volunteer orange map of Tennessee. Well, she knows I'm an Ole Miss Rebel, and she knows who we're playing this weekend. So it was just a little nod in that direction. And Karen, I want to thank you. That was very sweet of you.
Anytime.
Does anyone have any questions? I can go back to any slides.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhalter. Any questions from any members of the council? Don't see any.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll receive your presentation for the record. So at this point of the agenda, we will open the floor for discussion among the council members as to a recommendation to Commissioner McPeak. Who'd like to start? Does the council have a recommendation? Mr. Shenick?
I would like to get some clarification from Lisa Dennison. I believe, if I understood you correctly, that you said you used 3 years of data. Was that on a weighted average, or was this just a straight, pulling all the straight average? Straight average. Thank you.
Mr. Pitts?
Madam Chairman, you know I've never been reluctant to talk. I'm fearful that we'll sit here till 4:30 and nobody make a motion. So at least I'd like to see if I could precipitate some discussion. From a historic perspective, I guess what concerns me is I don't believe in the history of having battling actuaries. We wound up with this much distance between the three parties. And I just say that as an observation. And while everyone is laudatory of each other, that they all use the scientific method, and it's a disagreement in number of years used and what may be a trend as opposed to someone else believing it's consistently level. I do have concern about the variances between the three opinions, and I think we should all think about that a little bit. I can't resist, and this is the least part of the recommendations, But for the second year in the row, the two actuaries for the state and for the advisory council have supported my long issue of what the appropriate amount for LAEs is, and I applaud them for that. One of these years, we're going to stay there. But that really isn't the big issue with respect to this filing. Part of my concern is, and I know everything we do and going forward is based on data from the past, but a number of things are happening. We are just gone through a major reform. Some of those are subject to being calculated. Some of us are more optimistic that in the final analysis it's going to be better than we first thought, but we won't know that for several years. But in the meantime, what I'm really nervous about is, from a business point of view, I love rate decreases. But I also, from a business point of view, don't like great variances and shocks up and down, and I don't think the business community does. So I guess I'm going to say to you that conceptually, I'd rather err on the conservative side in making a recommendation than going for the downs for the biggest reduction, because I don't want, or hope we don't, come back next year and face the possibility of a rate increase. Hopefully it's another reduction. I know politically it'd be really neat to go announce a great big reduction, but I'm going to err on the cautious side as we have this discussion. And so we actually have before us three things. The three different entities have made a recommendation. You know what those are. I've even done a calculation that if you average those three, it's still a negative 6.5. I'll just toss out those figures for you to think about. If nobody else is inclined, at some point I will make a motion, but I don't want to cut off discussion at this point.
Ms. Hudgens?
Thank you. I don't get a vote, but I would like to express an opinion, and that's to reiterate what I said last year, which I have some concerns about using a 2-year period. Mr. Burkholder made a statement about they preferred to let the figures slide off rather than drop off. I think that there is a conservative approach there that fits with what seems appropriate to me. So I just wanted to state that I feel like wherever the recommendation is, it should be not as low as NCCI, because I do believe that they should have used at least a 3-year period. Thank you.
Any further comments? Is the council prepared to make a motion? Mr. Pitts?
Since we're all flying by the seat of our pants, I think everybody knows all the concerns, but I'm not sure anybody has a better answer than the other. It's going to be my recommendation that we stay with the 19.8 on LAE, and that the reduction be an average of the 3 or 6.5.
Is that a motion, Mr. Pitts? Yes, it is. Mr. Pitts so moves. Is there a second? From either Mr. Dove or Mr. Schaefer? Is there a second? Mr. Dove seconds. Ms. Schroeder, would you please restate the motion?
The recommendation is to stay with the 19.8 LAE, and the total reduction would therefore be a negative 6.5.
Is there any further discussion on Mr. Pitts' motion? Seeing none, the chair will call for a vote. Ms. Schroeder, please call the roll.
Carrie Dove. Paul Schaefer.
Aye.
Bob Pitts.
And the motion passes. Is there any further business to come before the council today? Mr. Pitts?
Only thing I'd like to say is everybody goes out and thanks or pines on this. It's tough to make these calls based on the information that's before us. But I think it, one, allows for a reasonable reduction in workers' comp multipliers, which ultimately a reduction in premium cost. And yet it gives an opportunity for another year of information to try to ascertain if any of these things that we believe may be going down or have leveled off, in fact, really are upticks. And err on the side of caution, I think the Advisory Council's made a wise decision.
Thank you for that explanation, Mr. Pitts. Is there any further business to come before the council today? Seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Pitts, second. Mr. Dove. With no further discussion, the council is adjourned, subject to the call of the chair. Thank you.